The 911 operator at the Oak Ridge Dispatch Center was used to the usual Friday night calls. Noise complaints, minor traffic accidents, or the occasional stray animal. But at 3:42 a.m. on a cold November morning, a call came in that would haunt her for the rest of her career. There was no screaming on the other end, no plea for help. Just the rhythmic, heavy sound of someone breathing, followed by the faint, metallic click of a deadbolt sliding into place. By the time police arrived at the sprawling colonial estate on the outskirts of town, the front door was wide open. The house was a balmy 74 degrees, contrasting sharply with the 30-degree frost outside. On the kitchen island sat a single cup of coffee, still steaming, and a set of car keys. But the woman who lived there, 34-year-old Elena Vance, was gone. In a town like Oak Ridge, people didn't just vanish. It was the kind of place where residents left their back doors unlocked and knew their neighbors' middle names. Elena was a respected architect, a marathon runner, and by all accounts, a pillar of the community. She was exactly 5 feet 6 inches tall, 125 pounds, and had a routine that was predictable to the minute. That predictability is exactly what made her disappearance so terrifying. When lead detective Marcus Thorne arrived at the scene, he noticed something the first responders had missed. In the mud near the driveway, there were tire tracks. They belonged to a heavy vehicle, likely a truck, parked about 50 yards from the front entrance. But there were no footprints leading to or from the house. It was as if someone had simply evaporated into the thin Missouri air. As the sun began to rise over the Ozarks, the first layer of Elena's perfect life began to peel away. Friends described her marriage to Julian Vance, a high-stakes corporate attorney, as the gold standard of relationships. They had been married for 8 years, lived in a $1.2 million home, and were planning to adopt. But when Thorne began canvassing the neighbors, he encountered a man named Silas, a retired veteran who lived in the cabin a half-mile down the road. Silas claimed that for 3 weeks leading up to the disappearance, he had seen a dark blue sedan idling at the edge of the Vance property every night at exactly 2 a.m. When Thorne asked why he hadn't reported it, Silas gave a response that chilled the veteran investigator to the bone. "I didn't report it because I thought it was the police." The driver was wearing a uniform. But there was no record of any patrol cars being in that area during those times. What the police didn't realize at that moment was that the 911 call hadn't come from Elena's phone. It had come from a burner phone, registered to a name that didn't exist, located less than 10 feet from where the dispatcher was sitting. As the search intensified, the timeline of Elena's final 24 hours began to emerge, revealing a series of events that defied logic. At 4 p.m. the previous day, Elena had visited a local hardware store. She bought 20 pounds of quick-dry cement and a heavy-duty padlock. She didn't look scared. The clerk said she looked determined. Why would a woman with no ongoing construction projects need cement in the middle of a Missouri winter? The investigation took its first dark turn when Julian Vance returned from a business trip in Chicago that afternoon. While he appeared distraught, his first call wasn't to his parents or Elena's family. It was to a private security firm specializing in reputation management. Thorne watched Julian from across the police tape. The man was composed, his suit perfectly pressed despite the chaos. But as Julian reached into his pocket for a cigarette, Thorne saw it. A deep, jagged scratch running from Julian's wrist all the way up his forearm, partially hidden by his cufflink. When asked about it, Julian claimed it was from a stray cat at his hotel. But the forensic team would later find that the DNA under Elena's fingernails back at the house didn't match her husband. It didn't match anyone in the national database. It belonged to someone the system said had been dead for 15 years. The mystery of Oak Ridge was no longer about a missing woman. It was about a ghost who had returned to claim a debt. As the first 48 hours drew to a close, the search dogs picked up a scent. It didn't lead toward the highway or the woods. It led directly to the basement of the Vance estate. A basement that, according to the original blueprints Elena herself had drawn, wasn't supposed to have a sub-level. But as the officers moved the heavy oak bookshelf in the study, they found the entrance a narrow concrete staircase leading down into the dark. The air coming from the hole didn't smell like a basement. It smelled like bleach, an expensive perfume. And then the sound started again, the rhythmic, heavy breathing, not from the stairs, but from the speakers hidden in the corners of the room. Someone was watching them. But that wasn't the strangest part. As Thorne descended the stairs, his flashlight flickered across the walls. They were covered in photographs, thousands of them, all of Elena. But she wasn't alone in the photos. In every single shot, taken over the span of a decade, there was a figure in the background. A man in a dark blue uniform, always exactly 20 paces behind her. In her office, in the grocery store, at her wedding. He had been there for every mile of her life, a shadow she never noticed. Until now. The digital clock on the wall of the hidden room was counting down. It showed 3 minutes and 14 seconds. Underneath the clock was a single manila envelope with Thorne's name on it. Inside was a map of a location 10 miles deep into the Mark Twain National Forest, marked with a single X and a date, November 14th. That was today. As the officer scrambled to mobilize a search team for the forest, a realization hit the forensic tech upstairs. The 911 call from earlier that morning hadn't been a live call. It was a recording, looped and fed directly into the dispatch system via a sophisticated hack. Elena hadn't vanished at 3:42 a.m. She had been gone for 3 days. The steam from the coffee cup in the kitchen wasn't from a fresh brew. It was from a hidden heating element beneath the granite countertop, designed to create the illusion of a recent presence. The entire crime scene was a stage play, meticulously directed by someone who understood police procedure better than the police themselves. As Thorne sped toward the coordinates in the forest, the temperature outside dropped to 22 degrees. The wind howled through the leafless trees, making the 5-mile hike from the road feel like an eternity. When they finally reached the X, they didn't find a body. They found a phone booth, standing alone in a clearing where no phone lines existed. It started to ring. Thorne picked up the receiver. A voice, cold and devoid of emotion, spoke 4 words that changed the entire trajectory of the case. Check the wedding video. Years later, a single detail from that video would change everything. But for now, the police were chasing a man who left no footprints and a woman who had spent her life building houses for people with secrets, perhaps while hiding the biggest one of all. Back at the house, the forensic team had finally managed to break into Elena's private vault. Inside, they didn't find jewelry or documents. They found a collection of uniforms. Post office, police, electric company. All tailored to fit a woman of Elena's exact proportions. The shadow in the photographs hadn't been following Elena. Elena was the shadow. But if Elena was the one in the uniform, then who was the woman who had been living as Elena Vance for the last 8 years? And more importantly, who was currently 150 pounds of dead weight lying in the trunk of a dark blue sedan crossing the state line into Illinois? The investigation was no longer about finding a victim. It was about identifying a predator who had successfully stolen a life piece by piece, until the original owner was nothing more than a ghost in her own home. As the sun set on the first day of the investigation, the realization set in. They weren't looking for a kidnapper. They were looking for the real Elena Vance, a woman who had spent a decade perfecting the art of disappearing while standing in plain sight. But the woman in the forest, the one Julian Vance called his wife, she was still out there. And she was beginning to realize that the cement she bought wasn't for a project. It was for a burial, her own. Would you like me to continue with the discovery of the wedding video and the revelation of the 2 Elenas theory?